on chemical risk assessment in itself. So I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes or so to just walk you through a couple of issues that we're having at the moment. I'm not dragging you through the different regulations and guidelines. That's a bit too boring. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you an overview of the problems that we're facing and of the different players and how they're interacting in terms of providing a risk assessment for chemicals in different contexts. Now we're going. So this is what we're concerned about. This is the simple fraction that we are discussing, that we're having so heavy discussions about. It's the ratio between the exposure to a chemical and the hazardous properties, the hazardous potential of the chemical, and we're trying to estimate both sides of that very simple equation that's more or less the holy grail of the risk assessment as we're doing that at the moment. The chemical risk assessment, of course, doesn't exist. Chemical risk assessment is specific for whether we are looking at human health issues, public health issues, or environmental related issues. Chemical risk assessment is heavily driven by the chemical use of the compound or compounds that we're trying to assess. So it's not driven by the physical-chemical characteristics or by the toxicological properties. It's driven by how we use the chemical, implying that one chemical can be actually assessed in different regulatory frameworks given its use in a certain context. Chemical risk assessment is country-specific on European level, different member states, US, Canada, other OECD member states, and we have a prospective approach and we have a retrospective approach. Prospective approach simply meaning that we try to get an idea about the risk of a chemical before we put it on the market. Retrospective simply meaning that we have an exposed population, we have an exposed ecosystem, and we want to get an idea how is the status there, are the chemicals having a detrimental effect on the health status, on the ecosystem status of the exposed system. And one thing that I really would like to stress at the beginning is that if you're looking back over the last, say, 50 to 60 years or something like that, chemical risk assessment is a real success story. We have really come a long way. We have a really good idea about how to handle certain issues when it comes to individual substances, when it comes to acute visible effects. Usually people don't die from chemicals immediately. When it comes to regulating point sources, meaning that we have an effluent pipeline or something like that, we know how to handle that. Sometimes there's a political issue connected to that, but from a scientific, from a risk assessment perspective, we have a pretty good understanding on how to handle those issues. But, of course, there is a but. The simple thing is that chemical use and chemical production is changing. It's a very dynamic system, and that also implies that exposure and toxicology is really changing. So we're not only concerned about individual substances anymore, it's chemical mixtures. We know that we are exposed to very complex cocktails of chemicals at the same time. That's an upcoming issue, or that's an issue that we really have to get a grip on. We're not only concerned about immediately visible effects, but we're also concerned about effects that are harder to detect at first sight, but still are really important in the long run. I'm going to give you some examples in a second. It's not only acute effects that we're concerned about, it's chronic, long-term, delayed effects that we really would like to get a grip on, that we really need to get a grip on. It's not only point sources anymore. What we are having is a widespread blanket of pollution. There is not a single ecosystem, there's not a single human body anywhere in the world where you don't find a whole chemical zoo if you're just looking for it. So it's from point source emissions, point source exposures, to a widespread blanket of pollution that we are concerned about. So things are changing, new challenges for risk assessment, and with some of them we are really struggling to actually accommodate. Just two examples, one from human toxicology, one from ecotoxicology, to sort of give you a bit of a backdrop there. This is just the correlation between the concentration of phthalate metabolites, so it's a measure of phthalate exposure, prenatal exposure to phthalates of mothers, obviously, in correlation to certain behavior of the kids. So it's not a direct toxic effect, a classic toxic effect, it's behavior effects on a human population level. And what we see is that we have a strong correlation between the concentration of phthalates, of phthalates metabolites that we find in the blood of the mothers highly correlates with the aggression that you find in the kids, the attention problems they have, the risk for depressions, and how they externalize problems. So we see that we have a real clear correlation between the exposure towards a chemical or a chemical class in that case and behavioral effects of the kids. And of course, you should argue from a scientific perspective, what we're seeing here is just a mere correlation. It's only the correlation between the concentration in the blood and behavioral effects of the kids. That's definitely true, but I actually would like to quote Douglas Adams here, who was simply saying that if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, we have to at least consider the possibility that we're actually looking at a small aquatic birds of the family Anatidae. That's what we're looking at. So correlation is no causation, definitely, but it's certainly a strong incentive, or it should be a strong incentive, to take a closer look. Where does that correlation come from? What are the causal links? Another example from ecotoxicology, how complex things can become when we are looking at exposures under realistic conditions. Copper is a well-known compound. We use that for different purposes, for a range of different purposes. At the same time, we have tremendous environmental issues there. We just had another major copper spill down in Mexico, where whole communities are heavily exposed to copper-contaminated drinking water. But copper also has problems at lower concentrations, at non-toxic concentrations. The thing is that, for example, salmon, the fish that we all like to eat, is preyed upon by trouts in its natural environment. The trouts are preying on the small salmon. And of course, whenever you have those ecological predator-prey relationships, there is a defense mechanism by the trout. They don't like to be eaten, obviously. So there's a defense mechanism. What happens is that if a trout is injuring one of the salmon is emitting a chemical cue into the water. They call that Schreckstoff, which is German for the scary stuff. They emit that into the water, and that makes all the neighboring salmon standing stock still. They don't move anymore, which means it makes it much harder for the trout to find the next prey. So that's the defense mechanism that is happening in the natural environment. The problem is very simple. Copper is interfering with the salmon's sense of smell. Meaning, if you have a certain copper concentration in the water, the salmon doesn't smell it anymore if a neighboring fish is injured. So they happily swim along and are happily getting eaten. So what we see here is an effect of a chemical in an ecological context that we usually overlook when we do standard chemical risk assessment, because that is very specific for the exposed organisms, it's very specific for the ecosystem. It still has substantial effects in an ecological context. And we are really struggling to get a grip on those indirect effects of chemicals. Whenever we do chemical risk assessment, I think we have to simply acknowledge the fact that it's an inherent conflict there. On the one hand, we have huge and tremendous societal uses and benefits for different chemicals, for different uses. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But there's also no doubt about that under certain conditions, chemicals have severe detrimental effects on human health and on exposed ecosystems. And we somehow have to work our way through that, and we have to come to a scientifically based honest discussion about that. And that perhaps is one of the major problems. Let me just give you one example of how two examples how different lobbying organizations are interfering in that process. While we were discussing the REACH system, which is the European framework for industrial chemicals, we had one stakeholder group that was running around. We need to get to the Swedes and to the Finns, and we need to neutralize their environmental arguments. Anybody any idea who that might be? It was actually Colin Powell, the US Secretary of State. At that time, he was cabling all the embassies in Europe. We need to educate other countries so that they can join the United States in raising concerns against REACH. It's a foreign country heavily interfering with the European legislative process. So that was a massive lobbying effort. Last time I checked, the US are not a member state of the European Union, so that was really something that was interfering there. Another example. This is another lobbying organization that is lobbying against Monsanto, which to my mind really defines a new law in how you do campaigning and how you try to convince people. It's not only that they are comparing Monsanto with the Nazist regime. I'm a German, so I really think that it's not the way to go. They are also listing journalists and scientists that they think are too friendly to Monsanto, put them out with a name in order to, we don't need to get into detail. For me, that is really frustrating and really defines a new law in terms of lobbying for or against a certain issue. Nina Fedorov, the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the guys who are publishing science and things like that, also seem to be feeling the same way. We're sliding back into a dark era. I'm profoundly depressed at just how difficult it has become to merely get a decent conversation started. And that is the critical issue. That is one of the main challenges that we're facing right now. The problem is junk science, the game of junk science, the idea that you use science for a certain purpose, ridiculing, distorting, and misrepresenting scientific research in order to generate uncertainty and thereby delaying or preventing appropriate action. That's the problem. I would like to give you just one example from personal experience. It's always more fun to talk about those things. In 2009, we had the mixture conclusion of the European Council, more or less saying that we are aware that people are exposed to chemical mixtures, not to individual compounds, so we better get going and do something about that. And the first thing that was started is let's try to get a state-of-the-art report, let's try to compile the evidence and the knowledge that we have so that we can identify the gaps and the way to move forward. I wrote that report together with two colleagues. We submitted that to the European Commission, and then we had a final discussion at DG Environment with all the stakeholders involved. These are the reactions from industry, and let me just quote you one sentence here. It is essential that conclusions of such a state-of-the-art report should be supported by the relevant literature in order to be a robust basis for policy making. I guess everybody would agree on that. Of course, that's exactly what the aim of such a report is. In that respect, the current report has serious shortcomings. You said that. What the hell did we do there? Were we not able to even collect the appropriate literature? What did we miss? And then you look at the list supplied then of things that we should have considered. So the serious shortcomings there. One publication here by Beate Escher and other colleagues, I know most of them personally, they are really good scientists, so there's no doubt about that, but that paper would have been important, except the fact it's an accepted manuscript. That publication is not out yet. So there was absolutely no chance in hell that we could have considered that paper. It might have been brilliant, it is good, but there's absolutely no way to do that. It continues along those lines. Here's a publication from René Kollwitz, Ökologie der pflanzlichen Saprobien, a German publication from 1908. Do we really think that a publication from 1908 is a central piece of evidence that we need for a state-of-the-art report in 2010? Doesn't really work that way. NGOs also submitted reactions. They assume no synergistic toxicity of the mixes. No, we did not. We did not assume anything. There are no sound scientific evidences that show synergistic interactions. And then continuing here, that we more or less work for the party whose profit depends on no toxicity being found. It doesn't really connect that way. No synergistic interactions doesn't mean no toxicity. There's absolutely no connection between those two items. So when you're seeing those comments on the work where we will try to do our best actually, when you see that, I really think I would like to go to Mark Twain, who simply said, folks, get your facts first, and then you can distort them as efficacy. I think that is, yeah. Okay, the problem that we're facing when it comes to those critical issues is normative science. Scientific information that contains tacit policy preferences and thus, by extension, promotes a particular policy option. So you use science in order to confirm what you already know from the very beginning. And the problem is that is not the way science works. Science works the other way around. One example here, what are the problems that we are facing when it comes to collecting those evidence and try to use that as a basis for chemical management? Atrazine is a very common herbicide, one of the most important herbicides used in the US, it's banned in Europe, and there's an ongoing debate on whether that's an endocrine disruptor. In 2008, Mr. Solomon and his group from Canada did a review on that, and they concluded in the end, after finishing that review, the central theory that environmentally relevant concentrations of atrazine affect reproduction, etc., is not supported. In short, atrazine is no endocrine disruptor. That was a very obvious statement from that report. 2 years later, that review was re-reviewed, with the conclusion that the most recent industry-funded review misrepresented over 50 studies and had 122 inaccurate and 22 misleading statements. And that's the central table here. I'm not going into too much detail, but what you can see is that when there are no effects of atrazine on endocrine endpoints, when there are no when Salomon et al. Concluded there are no effects, no environmental, effects at ecologically relevant concentrations, then what we see here is that Salomon et al. Actually gave that study a certain scientific credibility. So they say, if you don't find the effects, the science behind the study is good. And the other way around, if you find effects, Solomon et al. Criticized or cast out in most of the cases. So if there are no effects, it seems to be a high quality scientific study. If there are effects, it seems to be a low scientific quality of the study. And the main problem that we are facing here is that if you look at that table, if you look at that first review saying very clearly atrazine is no endocrine disruptor, the real review saying that's completely biased. Whom do you believe? What conclusions do you take from those two papers? It's a massive amount of evidence. Atrazine is well researched, far better researched than most other compounds that we have. And it's almost impossible to come to a conclusion from a regulatory perspective. What do we do now? So Arthur Clarke once said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I would like to rephrase that in terms of chemicals. Any sufficiently investigated chemical becomes indistinguishable from a very unknown chemical. The more we are collecting a lot of evidence, but it somehow still doesn't help us to actually come to an agreeable decision in the end. We have been working for certain chemicals for years and years and years, and the debate is still ongoing. And we need to get beyond that, one way or another. Because otherwise, that's where we're ending. We are really going back to the dark ages. The problem is when you're facing that conclusion that some people say that there is an effect. I have a lot of evidence here. Other people say the opposite. What it boils down to in a lot of cases is people are asking you to believe them. What does your gut tell you? Whom do you believe when you see those conflicting statements? And the problem is belief is something that we actually should keep in the church, and gut feeling is something that we should reserve for lunch. But we should not use that in a scientific discourse. So that's a real problem that we're facing there. We're trying to get beyond that, but I think we're just taking the first baby steps there. It's really a long way to go. Okay, let me just try to end with three more or less random thoughts there. I think the first thing is we simply have to acknowledge that for the vast majority of chemicals out there, we simply have to acknowledge the fact that we only have a very, very, very vague understanding of how they interact under realistic conditions with exposed humans, with exposed animals, plants, and other biota. And we have to act on that non-knowledge. We have to do something about that. We're doing that one way or another anyway, but we have to come to a better strategy on how we do that. That also means what we need is a far stronger and far more professional regulatory system. The people at regulatory authorities are usually doing their best, but they're understaffed, they're underfunded, and they don't have the political power to actually make things happen. And I think that is really something that needs to be changed. And last but not least, that's a bit near to my heart, of course, we also need to work towards establishing academia, again, as a major player in that field. I think academia really could or should become closer to the ideal thing of a more or less independent expert. We're getting further and further away with that because academia is more and more dependent on external funding. So I also think that is something that we should work on. And for that, I would like to close and thank